let's turn now to the war in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, of course, specifically. Reuters is reporting, we can put this element up on the screen here, that Finland has said, quote, outside activity likely damaged a gas pipeline and a telecoms cable. A subsea gas pipeline, Reuters says, and a telecommunications cable connecting Finland and Estonia under the Baltic Sea have been damaged in what may have been a deliberate act, the Finnish government said on Tuesday. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said NATO was sharing its information over the damage and stands ready to support the allies concerned. Finland joined the military alliance in April, while Estonia has been a member since 2004. The Baltic Connector gas pipeline was shut on early Sunday on concerns that gas was leaking from a hole in the 48-mile pipeline. Finnish operators said that it could take months or more to repair. We do have some video, actually, of that press conference yesterday. It's in Finnish, so we're going to do a little reading of the So the information that the Border Guard and the Coast Guard, this is the Prime Minister of Finland, received this morning. The leak is located in the Finnish exclusive. According to a preliminary assessment, the damage discovered could not have been caused by normal use of the pipeline or pressure fluctuations.
It is likely that the damage is the result of external activity, he adds. And so, right, so there also are there's seismic evidence that there was an explosion.
Right.
And they said they're still sorting through it, but they do have data that shows that there was an explosion right around the time that they saw the pressure massively drop. They're saying this is a very, very big hole in the pipeline. So just not the kind of thing that they can think of any way that this could have happened other than placing a bomb. This, if that's now, there's also the telecom pipeline that is a separate attack, which is cutting off significant amounts of communications. Gas prices rose in Europe as a result of this, obviously rising in Finland as well. If this is what we think it is, this would be payback for the West, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline.
Right. So, well, allegedly, of course, right? That was a conspiracy theory for all of, a week until the media was forced to admit because its own sourcing was telling them.
Yeah, and I think if we include Ukraine in the West, then I don't think there's anybody who questions that the West, broadly speaking, was responsible for blowing up this pipeline because we have now firmly established, I think, through lots of
preponderance of evidence,
basic evidence that it wasn't Russia.
Right.
We also have intelligence that Russia very quickly afterwards began kind of specking out and looking for bids to fix it.
Right.
So the idea that they would blow it up just to try to start fixing it right away, just strains reasoning to the point where it just breaks.
Another thing we should note is that gas prices, which were already spiking because of everything we've been talking about today, conflict that is rolling the Middle East, they were already going up, and in Europe they're up even higher after what happened on Sunday. Ryan, that question of payback for the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline is a really interesting one. Finland obviously just joined NATO. We talked about that earlier. And to some controversy, not a ton of controversy, but to some, there were some people who thought that wasn't wise. And now I think there's a question of whether everyone in Finland thinks that it was wise.
Yeah, for sure. And this is, so let's also talk about the way that this conflict is now going to play out in the wake of the explosion of violence in the Middle East. You immediately saw Zelensky put out a video saying that the Russians, were behind basically this Hamas attack. A real effort to kind of shoehorn that, that war into this one.
Yeah.
Clearly Iran has involvement, not operational involvement, but we know that Iran is a supporter of Hamas. Iran also has been allied with Russia on this Ukraine war. So I think from the Ukrainian perspective, they're like, all right, that's close enough. Let's say that Russia did this. But, Russia is not, Russia has tight alliances with Israel as well. And particularly a lot of the far-right members of the Israeli government have a lot of links with the Russians. So the idea that Russia is operationally supportive of this Hamas attack was always absurd. But the charge, I think, is interesting and revealing because it shows, I think, a real anxiety from the Ukrainians that this is going to be the beginning of the end of Western support for their war. That it's going to wind down into kind of a ceasefire at which Russia will then basically de facto seize the territory that they've gained so far, because a two fronts before Taiwan has opened up might be too much.
And Russia and China have both been critical of the U.S. in the wake of the violence over the weekend, which we were talking earlier in the show about the sort of echoes of what happened before World War I, what happened before World War II, let alone 9/11, which is the obvious parallel that everybody's drawn. And of course, geopolitics are always sort of shifting alliances and coalitions. But I think what we are seeing does really have serious echoes of early 20th century, mid 20th century stuff, because these alliances are starting to coalesce in ways over, like, for instance, oil prices right now. Iran, Saudi Arabia. So when you look at the Abraham Accords and how that was an effort, Biden has been trying to bring together Saudi Arabia and Israel. Iran is on the other side of the conflict with Hamas. Gas prices, oil prices are at the center of all of this. And then and the same goes for Russia and Ukraine. Yeah. The coalescing of these really big superpowers, and China is a huge factor that has sort of been allied with Russia in Ukraine. And Iran, by the way, has been allied with Russia and Ukraine to varying degrees. That's, again, very unsettling, to say the least.
Right, and people are making a lot of comparisons, like you said, from October 7th to September 11th, but the key date that they're leaving out of that is 2001 versus 2023. The U.S. Place in the world is entirely different in 2023 than it was in 2001. 2001, Russia had just become Russia after 10 plus years, about 10 years earlier, and had gone through the greatest collapse in GDP and human misery and cost and just quality of life and life expectancy in human history throughout the 1990s. So Russia is just completely flat on its back. China is 22 years back in time from the exponential growth that they've seen over those 22 years. So they were in no capacity to be flexing anything outside of their very specific region. So when we decided that we were going to follow invading Afghanistan with an invasion of Iraq, the UN could say whatever they want. The world can say whatever we want. We were just going to do it.
Yeah.
Like there was absolutely no check on our kind of military power at that time. Now, we eventually found that the reality of occupying a country for several years that didn't want us to be occupying it was its own check, and that becomes its own insurgency and develops into ISIS, et cetera. But in terms of other geopolitical forces checking the United States, there were none. Today there are.
Right.
And so I think that really inhibits the kind of room that we have to maneuver and how many kind of fronts we can take on these different violent conflicts, while also, like China, making inroads in our own backyard.
Yes, and we would be remiss if we didn't mention that nuclear weapons are at the center of absolutely all of this. That's something that weighs very heavily on Israel, obviously, given and places like Gaza, Palestinians' minds, given how small these areas are, how close they are to nuclear powers. But we're talking about all nuclear powers here, for the most part, when we talk about where these coalitions are, what they're turning into. And when that happened before, when the Cold War was front of mind, we saw the United States funding, getting behind Mujahideen, and a lot of people now looking back on Israel's history with Hamas, of course, and decisions that were made about where to, sort of give support and money in different circumstances. So these nuclear conflicts, we have so much history to learn from, and it feels like we're not learning from any of it.
Yeah. So at the end of the show, we're going to talk to Palestinian American advocate and policy analyst Yusuf Munir. But I think we need a break from this for a little bit. So let's talk about Hillary Clinton and George Santos.
Yeah, why not? Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.